Welcome everyone. It's Business Storytelling with Mushin-Makedonskiy, and today I have a special guest who is showing us how it's done to prove the stories really work. And I'm telling you about not telling a story to prove the stories work, but actually investigating this really magnificent field. I give you Kendall Haven, a professional in storytelling with 38 years in the field, who has actually helped to find the field of neural story science, because since 1983, he has been working in the field and investigating stories with the National Storytelling Association. And given that Kendall is a scientist in his background in oceanography, those were not simple, story tales. Those were real investigations, and that's what we are going to talk about today. So, Kendall, I can't wait to start talking about what is inside the human brain and how the stories work.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation myself.
Perfect. Kendall, just to begin with, we know that stories really influence our brain in different ways, and there has been numerous research explained in your books. But let me just start by asking you this question that really ticks me. You said that every person perceives the story as the story-based form, like individually, while hearing it. And my question is kind of tricky, because to me that poses a clear challenge. How can we control what the audience thinks if every one of us sees and perceives the story into his own individual experience? And maybe you could explain some more on that to our audience.
Sure. And the short answer to your question is you can't. The slightly longer answer is that other than for very simple stories that are designed only to engage and entertain, effective stories are all target audience specific. The more you know about the audience you want to reach, the more effectively you can reach that audience. So if we're looking at business storytelling, when I work with businesses, one of the hardest things for them to do is to identify exactly who they really need to reach. They usually want to reach a very wide audience, but they really don't. They really always have a specific audience that they absolutely positively need to reach. The question is, how much do you know about them? For the study of story, especially the work I've been doing in the last 5 years, it's been based on two questions. And this is both background and also getting a little ahead and jumping in a little bit, but it fits here. The two questions are, how does the human brain make sense of incoming information? And I'll give you an example of that first question. As you're starting to listen to a story, I'll use story here as an example. In your brain, you have to form some kind of a mental structure of the story. You don't know the whole story yet. You only know that first sentence. And yet, even on that first sentence, generally speaking, people have amazing insights about the story. Quick example. I'll take one of Aesop's fables. Those are always fun. First sentence: a haughty peacock taunted a sparrow over the dullness of her plumage and laughed. Okay. Now, a couple of questions. Who's that story about? You could probably answer.
The peacock, basically.
What's the story about?
I guess the conflict between them, and
how's the story going to end?
It's something related to a sparrow being an underdog, and she should be overcoming, or the peacock should be shamed, or
Now, what happened? None of that information is in the first sentence, by the way. The answers to the question that I gave you, and yet the human mind automatically, in order to start to make sense of this incoming information, has to create those kinds of structures. Those structures are all story based. In other words, it's not, the question isn't, are you going to tell a story? If you're a business, say, are you going to tell a story? No, wrong question. The fact is that the audience members individually and collectively will structure the information you provide in their own minds in story form. So if you understand the elements that they use, the informational elements that they use to make sense of that incoming information, you get to control how those bits of information are provided. What happens is, if I, the teller of the story, don't provide those essential bits of information to you, you create them on your own, which means that I, the teller, lose control of the story. I no longer am able to reach you because you're listening to your own story, not to mine. So the first part of neural story science is to understand how initially the human brain tries to create those initial structures to make sense of incoming information. It's story-based, and it's using those essential elements of story that we've researched. Second question, having had this information make sense, how do we create meaning from it? That's what you're after, is controlling the meaning. And so that's then the second question that we started to research. The sources of information that get used by each individual audience member to make sense and to create meaning are the source material, the story that you provide. And if you engineer the story correctly, you get to provide a majority of the information that they use. So you have a fairly good control over the story that forms in their heads that they see. The other source is their own experiences. That's where audience modeling and audience analysis come in. The more you can characterize your audience, the more then you can describe the characters in your story, the situations in your story, the dilemmas in your story to resonate with that audience. So that's really what story science is all about, is how to do that. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. But again, the short answer is you can't completely control it. But if you know a little about the audience, you can do an incredible job of controlling how they make sense of and create meaning from your information.
Perfect. I like the answers that go with no, but because those are the challenges, and those are the challenges we need to face and to overcome when doing our job. It's not only about storytelling. So thank you for that. Kendall, what I wanted to dive deeper in with you, you've already started to say that story form has specific elements, and I already see the main character being the peacock and this other things that are there. So
Oh, and by the way,
yeah,
if I just want to interrupt, if I had reversed that sentence and said a sparrow was taunted by a peacock, you would have said the main character was the sparrow.
yeah,
We tend to grab the first character mentioned until we're forced to abandon that character as the main character. So that those are the kind of little cues that the brain is just is hardwired to rely on to make those structure. I mean, and there are dozens of those kinds of cues that we've been able to uncover. And once you see them, you have a much better sense of how to get the mind of your audience to create the story and to start to identify with and empathize with the characters in the story that you want them to. I'm sorry. So go ahead.
No, that's a very powerful comment. And even despite that I didn't see the George Martin's Game of Thrones, it's what happens in the first season. Everyone starts following Ned Stark, and then shwit, and no more Ned Stark, and everyone goes crazy. And
I read the books. I have not yet seen any of the videos, but I read the books, and I got to the fourth book, and I realized that everyone I'd ever cared about had already been killed in the whole series. There's a great long list, and I said, "Wow, why am I reading this?"
Martin is great at abandoning characters, so to speak. Okay, that's awesome. So let's just discover some more of that story form. You said that there's a main character, and I know from your interviews in your book. Let me just summarize it real quick, because I have a question that goes a bit further. So there are main character, a goal that the character has, some kind of complication. Then there goes climax character, which helps resolve this complication, and then there is a resolution. Have I mentioned all
Okay.
of them, or more or less?
You've got, let's go a little bit farther.
Yeah.
There's a main character, and the main character has to be after something. That's a goal. What the main character wants or needs to do or get in the story. It has to be something tangible. The more I research it, the more I find that the critical question is, why does the main character want that goal? We're now looking at motives. Motives explain why a character wants what they want, does what they do. What we find is, if I want an audience to identify with, to empathize with a character, more than anything, what they use are the motives of that character, not the actions. It's not what you do, it's why you do it. So often, particularly in business stories, we never want to mention those kinds of motives. And so what happens is that every audience member implies them on their own, based on their own experience. And that's the last thing you want. You want to be in control of the motives that they ascribe to each character, which means that you need to be much better at first identifying and then articulating the motives for the characters that you want to present. So we have character, goal, motive. And then, of course, example. Simon wanted to be promoted to be department chair, the head of the department. Okay, character and a goal. And we can go into why he wants it. You know, his girlfriend said she wasn't going to marry him unless he was a bigwig. He wanted to. His mother is sick and needs medicine, and he wants to be able to he needs more money and in position to be able to pay for the medicine. Blah blah blah. Okay, we have motives. Depending on those motives, you'll decide if you want Simon to get the promotion or not. If I said why did he want it? Because he wants to squash all the other people around him that have been mean to him on the job. He wants to lord it over everyone. He wants to be, if he could get a promotion, he'd be high enough up so he could steal from the company and get away with it. If I start to give him motives that you think that are antithetical to your own set of motives and values, you'll turn on that character. If I give him motives that are consistent with your own values and your own motives, you'll start to empathize with and root for that character. So I can control the relationship between character and audience by the motives that I allow the audience to consider for why that character wants what he wants. Now, the next question is, so he wants to be department chair, so why isn't he? We need to bring up problems. Now, problems and conflicts. Something that blocks him from getting to the goal. Well, he hasn't done very well in any of his performance reviews, and there are 3 people who have done real well in the department who are senior to him, who really would be promoted first. So those are then obstacles to him, so that then the character has to. The question is, what we're then looking for to create excitement and tension in the story are risk and danger. Risk is the likelihood that something's going to go wrong. The probability of failure. Most companies hate to admit that there's any risk and likelihood that something's going to go wrong. And yet, if they would gain incredible support from the audiences, because if the higher the risk and the higher the danger is what would happen if something goes wrong, the more that we are impressed by people who will face the risk and danger to still struggle to get to a goal. I mean, if I said to you, I'm going to lay a piece of a long plank of wood on the floor and dare you to walk on the wood from one end to the other, you'd say, okay, no big deal. But if I suspended 1,000 feet up in the air and say, and it's, let's say it's 10 meters long, and then say, all right, climb up this ladder 1,000 feet in the air and now walk across it. Well, whereas if it's just lying on the ground, no one would care. As soon as I hang it 1,000 feet in the air, I could charge tickets. I could charge a lot of money for people to come in and watch you try to walk across that. What's changed? The action hasn't. It's still walking across the exact same board.
The
What's
characters is
changed
still the
risk
same.
and the character's the same, the action's the same. What's changed is risk and danger.
Yeah.
We are literally, as a species, addicted to risk and danger. Well, not so much for ourselves, but we want to tune into it for other people. We want to avoid it for ourselves and tune into it for other characters. So thinking the more risk and danger that you can insert into the story, the more engrossed the audience is, and the more they tend to empathize with the character. Okay, so now we have, what was his name, Simon, and his goal, and the challenges that he faces. There are 3 other people who are senior to him who should be promoted first, who have all done very well on their on their reviews, and he's gotten really lousy reviews from his bosses. So now the question is, what is he going to do to try to overcome those challenges to get to his goal? And that finally is where the plot, the action of a story starts to become relevant. And every time he takes an action, we will infer from that his values, his attitudes, and his motives. So first thing he did was plant a bomb in his boss's office to blow up the office and get rid of all of those reviews so they wouldn't be seen. And if he blew up the boss at the same time, well, that's all right. And so there's an action to overcome, but so we take it and use and imply from that what are his values and what are his attitudes, and compare them to our own to decide if we want him to succeed or not. So that's that value, that motive question that we're using to evaluate the story. So when the story goes on, at some point he will come to the last of the obstacles that stands between him and his goal. And he'll have to confront that obstacle. That's what we call the climax moment of the story, is when the main character confronts the final obstacle standing between them and their goal. At that moment, the question is, who holds the power to make that come out, that moment come out the way that that character wants it to? I'm calling that the climax character. Especially for business stories, it's critical. Let's dump Simon and use a business example. Let's use an internal business example. Let's say you have a population of people that are desperate to communicate with each other, even though they are spread out over many, many miles. And the only way they've been able to do it is, to hop on a horse and trudge through chest deep snow to try to get to the where the other people are, back and forth with all these different little clusters of people. And half the time when that happens, they die on the way, but it's the only way they've got. And the more they need to communicate, the greater the risk. If someone comes in and says, here's a radio, and all you have to do is have each person have a radio, and you don't have to go anywhere, that person isn't really who the story is about. But that person, that company would have the power to arm the main character, let's say one of the people in one of those little communities, with the ability to achieve their goal for the story. And there's a lot of times people talk about the role of the hero in a story. The closest thing when we really start to analyze stories to the role of hero is that climax character. Except the climax character doesn't have to be a positive outcome character, and a hero does. The climax character could be someone who acts to make sure that the main character fails to get their goal. So we have a negative outcome. And that's a very legitimate kind of story. but it's not a heroic story. So the term hero actually is counterproductive. It's better to just get rid of it and talk about the functions that different characters play. So we then have that character, that resolution moment happens, that climax moment happens, and then we get to the resolution. Resolution has the following pieces of information that an audience needs. Does the main character achieve their goal, yes or no? And how do they feel about it? And that cues the audience, if they have been forced to empathize with the main character, into how the audience will feel about the story. And it is that residual emotion that we feel at the end of the story that then drives behavior change. So if you want to drive an action in an audience, it's controlling that emotion at the end. Those are those elements that we find that audiences really need. Then within each of those elements, there are little pieces and bits that you can work into your story that control those different major elements.
Perfect. That's really a swift and really clear description. And what I especially like, and thank you for that, is clarifying that a goal is nothing without the motive, and the motive is that something that we hook upon, and something that we should work to get towards. And I actually have two questions, and
Sure.
we can just begin with one of them. So I get asked a lot of the time on storytelling workshops, like, okay, we have the character, we have the goal. For example, it's a personal story that I've lived through, and I want to
Mhm.
share it so people like get the right behavior. For instance, a person went through a series of events that taught him that, or her, that setting a goal is not enough. You have to check whether the goal of the person next to you, who are you working with, is aligned with your goal. If you do not, you will fail, because you can step into a dark place you don't want to be in. And here's the tricky question. From the point of view of studies that really get into how brain works, is it relevant if a story has not only how the story ends and how the person feels, but some kind of a lesson, like, and here's why, folks, we should be doing this, blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, not in terms of folk tales, but in business context.
Okay.
Does there have to be a moral or, a formal lesson?
Let me turn it around a little bit. There will be a lesson, because the human brain of the receiver, we find, it automatically becomes a meaning creating machine. It seeks meaning. That means that the audience, in listening to this story, if they don't get bored and completely tune it out, they actually listen to it, will seek meaning, and they will decide for themselves what that meaning is. The problem is, if you're telling the story, you want to control that meaning. All right. So they will create meaning. The most effective use of story is to say, story is not my message. Story is the vehicle that delivers my message most effectively and accurately into the conscious mind and memory of my audience. So you have to start with, what is it? I was doing some programs with the Department of Defense. This particular one was the Singapore Department of Defense. And so I was using they were looking for an analogy, and I said, okay, story is the missile, but it's not the warhead. The job of the missile isn't to blow up anything, it's to carry the warhead where you want it to go. Then and only then can it, so if the missile doesn't accurately deliver the warhead is wasted. The warhead can't do its job if it doesn't get there, but the missile, its job isn't the message, its job is just the delivery system. In the same way, story is the delivery system. It is the way that you organize your material. But you have to start with, what is it I want people, what's the message? So often we hope that if we build a story, the message will evolve out of it. And a message always will. For the audience members, the question is whether or not you, the teller of the story, have any control over that message. And if you don't start by saying, this is what I want my story to get across, this is the message, that this is what I got to say, and start there and then say, how do I structure a story to deliver that message? If you start there, it may be that at the end of the story, you've got to say, and I told you this story because here's what I want you to remember. It may also be that it's such an integral part of the story, you don't need to say that. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's that ultimately your job is always the same. Deliver your message powerfully and accurately into the mind and memory of your target audience. The story and all of the structure and the elements and the phrasing of the story are tools that let you do that. If at the end you still need to say, and here's why I told you this, here's the point of this story, fine. Disney movies are famous for not trusting their audience enough to figure out anything. And so they beat you over the head with what the message is, and it becomes counterproductive. They push you
Maybe
away
an
from the
example of,
story because they overdo it. At the end of every movie, someone will say, oh, I guess I should have blah, blah, blah. And we're thinking, oh yeah, we figured that out 15 minutes ago. So your job is to make sure that that the message does get in there. There is no one way to do it. There is no one place to insert that message. Certainly at the resolution point of the story, that resolution and the way the story ends should reinforce your message. But if you start with saying, here's my message, this is what I got to get the story to do, then as you develop the story, you always have a metric to fall back on and say, does my story accomplish what I wanted it to do? You have something real concrete that you want the story to do, so you can always then use that as a measuring yardstick against which to evaluate the story. And however you get the message across, fine.
Perfect. Like the answer, because I always say that it really depends on the audience and on the temperature in the room,
Sure.
on the difficulty of this thought. Because if you choose like some kind of a folk tale, or, you know, an ancient Chinese tale that goes with some kind of monk, you have to throw the bridge over to the meaning, because some people do not easily associate themselves with the monk and like, what is he talking about? So
Yeah.
that's a great answer. Thank you,
As
Kendall.
long as you can get the meaning in there
Yeah.
and make sure that the audience gets it, fine.
Perfect. So getting the meaning over with this missile and warhead metaphor, and that's a great way to see it. And even despite that it's a war metaphor, it doesn't matter. It's really on point. Second question here is actually what you said, hero. The word hero being counterproductive. Thank you so much for that, because I hear the hero's journey all of the time, and that's not the storytelling I'm talking about, and that really grinds my gears. But here's the thing. You also said that there's a climax character that defines whether the story goes up or down, to the victory or to the loss. And here's the question. For some time now, I've been researching the power of the stories that prove values of the company. And sometimes when the moment comes, the person decides based on his own inner values. So should we say that those inner values are the climax character, so it can be not a person? Or in terms of brain, how does brain react to this moment?
The climax character does not have to be a sentient live character. Often in corporate stories, it will be say for internal stories, within the company, it might be a new program that will provide certain benefits to the employees.
Oh, got it.
They solve some problem. So it's best, the more tangible it is, the more easily visualized it is by the target audience, the more clear it is, the better, more effective the story is going to be. So as long as this can be really clearly defined. The trouble with values of a character, they're really character traits. They're part of the character. And so technically speaking, for that example you just did, an employee, let's say a real simple one. An employee is tempted to cook the books and steal some money from the company. They might have the greatest, best motives in the world. At some moment, at the climax moment, really what happens is the main character in that story splits and becomes not only the main character, but also the antagonist, the embodiment of the biggest obstacle that stands between them and their goal. And so at the climax moment, it's an internal struggle. Do I do it or do I not do it? Do I cheat or do I withhold the values that I was taught in the company and not do it? So that it's those two parts, those two characters, both of whom are the main character, but they represent different value sets within the main character. So that the character, it's not the value set, but it's the character, that sort of that version of the main character that becomes the one of those that then wins, dominates in that climax moment, then becomes the climax character and defines how the story ends. So the climax character does not have to be a human, doesn't have to be a live character, but the more often you can, the closer you can come to it being a live character, the easier it is to have your target audience visualize that character in the story and visualize that moment when that climax moment when that character's power comes to fruition and comes to bear.
So if I get that right, for instance, if we talk about value story, if we do not focus solely on the values of the person making this decision to do what's right or what's easy, but rather focusing on that he's thinking about other people, like what is it for them, like how does it affect someone? If he doesn't show his value, maybe it's bad for someone. Maybe
Yeah.
that's a better way. I mean, in terms of
that would certainly work. And so that, there's an old saying, the best fighting is against yourself. Those
yeah.
internal struggle stories are very powerful because, truth be told, we all do those fights on a regular basis, even over really simple little things. You buy something, someone gives you too much change. Do you say, oh, wait a minute, you gave me
Yeah.
an extra dollar, or it gave me too much money, and here, take it back? Or do you say, oh, thank you very much, and pretend like you didn't notice?
Yeah.
But that's an internal value conflict. So really, you're fighting against yourself, and in every one of those, there's incredible risk and danger, because what's at risk is your own image of yourself. And so that when your internal values start to fight within the context of a company story, what happens is that you're letting the personal values and attitudes and motives of a character be added on to what the company wants, as what company expects people within the company to adhere to, what values, what attitudes we expect you to have. So that you're playing those value sets off against each other. It's easiest to do if you personify both of them, person fighting against themselves. But however you can make it work so that the audience cast themselves into the middle of that dilemma and says, oh, what would I do if I was
Yeah.
there?
That's the right question.
Then the story wins. Then the
Yeah.
story is effective.
Perfect. I like this evaluation really much. That's great. Thank you for that. Kendall, moving on from this, the story form, which is the great topic and it's really useful, and it was really an insight for me to see that it really affects the brain if you put the characters in the right order. I mean, I knew that, but in terms of brain science, that
Yeah.
was great. But what was another insight for me is that negative stories lead to a more immediate behavior than positive stories. And when I heard it first time on the podcast, I guess it was Park Howell's podcast, Business of Story,
Mm.
and I was like, oh my God, what is the point of telling positive stories then? So here's my question. If negative stories lead to a more immediate change in behavior, how can we combine the two, the positive and the negative stories
Yeah.
in business? Maybe there are certain tasks for each type, or
Yes. Let's be more specific. What we find when we track people, and this is also what we observe on the streets. If you want to cause a riot in the streets, people go out and protest. Also, if you are say an NGO and you're doing a fundraising campaign and you want people to give you money, a story that ends negatively for a character you've made the audience care about will drive immediate behavioral shift. They'll do something. They'll write a letter. They'll give money. They'll go out on the street and protest. But as soon as that action is taken, the audience tends to go back in terms of attitudes and values and behavior to right where they were before. So it's a short-term behavioral shift, not a long-term attitude, value, or behavioral shift. Stories that end positively tend not to create an immediate, noticeable measurable behavioral shift, but do tend to set up what we would call role model stories, so that long term in the future, when situations come up, when opportunities come up, those positive ending stories tend to linger longer, and so in the future have more impact on attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. Then a really effective campaign uses both positive and negative stories depending on what response they want. The company, say, that's doing the campaign, what kind of response they want from specific different target audiences. Look at folklore. Any country, look at the folklore from any country, and you'll find cautionary tales where things go badly for a character, and you'll find tales that come out positive for a character, role model tales. We tend to mix those two all the time because they affect the brain in different timescales and in slightly different ways. And you want to use both tools when they are appropriate for your own purposes.
Perfect. So let me just sum it up real quick. Negative stories tend to cause immediate behavioral change, but in terms of attitude and long-term behavior change and long-term changes into the person, we need to focus on positive stories, because after negative stories, people tend to shift back.
It tends not to shift attitudes and beliefs. It just creates a demand, an internal demand to do something, take action. So there's a measurable behavioral response to the story.
Yeah.
But positive stories, while they don't usually generate that immediate behavioral shift, and so the psychological studies on stories have focused on negative stories because that meant that right after the story there was something to measure. You didn't have to wait and revisit that audience 6 months down the road or a year down the road. You'd have something to measure right away. But positive stories tended not to generate immediate noticeable impacts, behavioral shifts, but yet on a long-term basis, positive stories are the ones that set up models for how we tend to affect individuals. And I suspect mostly what it does is slightly shift the way that for our own internal uses, frame and word our goals. we tend to say, the character in the story was, they did blah, 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 so I should do that. And it tends to shift the way that we set our own personal goals. So in that way, we're then affecting our attitudes, because our attitudes then are a dependent function on our goals. And then long term, you start to see behavioral shifts, but not necessarily short term at all.
Perfect. Got it. That's really clear. And I mean, in terms of this differentiation, we can clearly see that negative stories are great for the times of when you need to control like safety, and you need to
Sure.
install some new equipment.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect.
Or yeah, there suddenly are interdepartmental wars within a company,
Yeah.
and it could really completely destroy the company. When immediate behavioral shifts are needed, stories that are and negatively are more productive faster than positive ones.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a really great clarification there. Kendall, here's one more thing I wanted to ask you, and it's actually what we started with. The story is only the thing that carries the meaning, like the servant for the message. But I saw a lot of approaches to storytelling where people start by first telling and discovering what happened, like telling the situation, and then coming back. And after they told the story, they discovered the meaning from what the audience said to them, like the harvest process by Mary Alice Arthur or different storytellers. So
Sure.
in that way, there are processes when a story is understood and the meaning is crafted after the story is here. And there are processes when the meaning is here and you need to craft the story. What I feel is that's actually just a part of the question. What I feel is that the first process where you have the meaning and you need to craft the story, it may sometimes be artificial. Like the meaning is creating the story, and it's not very natural. And on the same time, the second process is natural but not so efficient, because you have to choose the story, and if the story doesn't fit the meaning you need in the end, you don't need to use it. So can we balance it? Like, can I hear some thoughts from you on this processes and how do we balance them?
Okay. Again, ultimately, the question is, what do you want to accomplish with the story? The human brain is a meaning-creating machine. If it pays attention, it will create meaning from what it pays attention to. So if I improv a story, get up on stage and talk about something that happened and ramble on, the audience members will either get bored and leave, or they will create meaning. If then I stop and we then sort of the audience talk about, well, what did you get from that story? And I can seek the meaning that they got and see if that matches in with something of value to me that I maybe could use in the future. However, if I'm doing it that way, I, the teller, have relinquished what I would consider part of my responsibility as the teller. And that is to be aware of what I am asking the audience to pay attention to, what I'm asking the audience to give their time and energy into. If I'm a company, it's an incredible risk to say, well, we're going to tell a story and we'll worry about later what it means. More often than not, what it's going to mean is something you didn't want it to mean to the audience. So while that's a really fun exercise, I don't think it's appropriate if there is any reason to tell the story other than to tell it for the sake of telling it, to then explore with the audience what they got from that experience. So to look at it, to start with with what it is you want to say, and then say, yes, I need to create a story or find a story that carries that message, that doesn't negate, in my mind, the mandate that you create an effective story. Just because it says exactly what you want it to say, just because it's a handy story, doesn't excuse you from the requirement that you created a story that will engage your audience, will hold their attention, will emotionally involve them. That is to say, will be an effective story. An effective story always sounds real. An effective story always sounds, what was the word that you used that I wanted to come back to? An effective story always
Naturally, I guess.
it sounds natural and makes sense to the audience. It doesn't matter. It can be about a talking teacup, and it can sound as real and natural as when I'm telling the story about what I did yesterday. If I create those characters in a believable way, that are in a way that's relevant to my audience, and create situations, goals, and motives for those characters that are relevant and real to my audience. That's my mandate, is to engage the audience in stories that sound real, relevant, and natural to them. The source of the stories can be anything. It can come from anywhere. It can come from my actual real experiences, and I've got a couple that I use because something happened, and it is a perfect example of something I wanted to share. I also have a number of little fictional stories that I use because they're perfect examples of something I wanted to share. As long as the story seems genuine and engaging to the audience, it can do its job, which is to open up the mind of the audience to the story and to the messages that the story carries.
Perfect. Completely understood. So basically, what I heard is you don't need to forget that the main reason to tell a story is to convey a meaning, and discovering a meaning from a story
Yeah.
is not a bad thing. So
Not a bad thing.
okay,
It's not a bad thing. It just
perfect.
means that you're not necessarily always the one in control of what that meaning is.
Yeah, perfect. Kendall, that's great, and that's really insightful in terms of we're talking about easy things, but I would say simple, but those things are not always easy. So thank you once again for sharing. And
They're basic.
yes,
They actually are, because we can see. I haven't done this kind of research, and I have no interest in it. But the researchers who do have found that babies as young as 2 months old respond to the exact same elements of story
wow,
that
really,
are resonant for an adult. They're watching
wow,
eye movement and body posture and breathing rates, and the kinds of the cues that they're using to show what it is that even a pre-language child pays attention to. So this isn't about something that we learn. It's about something that is really inherent in the DNA of a human being. It is the way we are constructed. And so it's very basic to human beings, but unfortunately it's not housed in the conscious mind. It's usually housed in the subconscious processors. So we can't think about it because it's not housed in the conscious part of our mind.
yeah. Yeah, and that's a tough challenge, and that's a great part to come to the last two questions, because those are just traditional questions that I ask
Sure.
to all our guests on this podcast. And
Okay.
first one would be, what would be your advice for people who want to develop storytelling skills and they are only at the beginning of their journey, like the people that are still not in the conscience mode? That's why I asked this question.
Okay. First, let's split the word storytelling into two halves. Story is a thing. It's
Yeah.
a physical thing. It's an it you can it like any other valuable asset. You can bank it, you can sell it, you can share it, you can hoard it. Telling is a verb. It's an interactive process. Every human being tells stories. you learned to be an effective storyteller by the time you were 2 or 3 years old because you realized that was the way to get what you wanted to get. But it's, as is true with most other things that we do a lot, we tend not to house that information in our conscious mind. Conscious mind is the slowest processor in your brain. Subconscious processors are much more efficient and much faster. And so you tend to store the things that you do routinely, both automatically, have a heartbeat, breathe, but a number of other things that you tend to store in your subconscious processors. A good example is tying shoelaces. You know how to tie shoelaces, right? I will guarantee you couldn't write down on a piece of paper in temporal sequential order what you do with each thumb and finger when you tie your shoelaces.
Oh my God, that's true.
No one's ever done it. I've never had anyone do it, been able to do it so that you could follow their directions and actually tie your shoelaces. But we can all do it. In the same way, we all tell stories, but we do it subconsciously. We do it automatically. The best thing you can do is start to watch yourself, especially yourself, but watch others when they're telling stories, but especially detach a little bit of your mind from, when you're telling stories to friends or to family, and watch yourself and see how you do it when you're comfortable and not stressed, not like standing in front of an audience and presenting a talk, but see what it is when you're natural and on, and become consciously aware of what are your natural storytelling style, and use that as the basis for developing effective conscious storytelling.
Perfect. So start noticing yourself, start being conscious about telling a story when you're feeling comfortable to build your
Right.
style,
Right.
you feel your authenticity in this process.
Yep.
Great.
Because everyone has a slightly different natural, effective storytelling style.
Yeah.
And this isn't acting. So you're not going to learn to act like someone else or tell like somebody else. You're going to tell like yourself because that's what you've spent a lifetime working on.
Perfect.
You're just going to use it, but become consciously aware of it, not subconsciously.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. That's really valuable because a lot of people are afraid of doing it because they think they don't know how to do it right. Yeah, they don't know, but
They don't
knowing,
consciously know,
yeah,
but
starting
they do
knowing,
know. It's in there. It's
yeah.
in there, just in the wrong place. It's in the wrong file folder.
Yeah, we should replace it. So the final question, and it's about the story, and it goes like this. I want you to finish the phrase. It takes one thing to get from a good story to a great story, and that one thing is
The right audience. Their effective stories are audience specific. There is no such thing as a great story, period. Because what's a great story for one group, for one age group, for one demographic, is boring and redundant or confusing for another. It's matching the story with the right audience, or given the audience that you're going to work with, adjusting and matching the story to them so that it resonates with that audience, and then at that moment it becomes a great story.
perfect. I like how it all started with an audience and understanding the people you're telling to, and it finished with the audience also as an advice. Kendall, that was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much that you've been here on the show and shared your insights.
It was
It's
a
a
delight.
pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. Have a great day.